Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I want to speak to you today about what I believe are among the greatest threats facing not only Australia, but Western society and Western civilization itself. That's what I'll be talking about tonight. First of all, I'll look at how did we get here to where we are today in terms of the attacks on our culture, and then I will look in turn at what I consider the greatest threats facing us. Then I will put forward some proposals to deal with the threats. A lot of this information is drawn from my book, but before we begin, let me say something about the inevitable reaction this discussion will provoke. The moment anyone dares to defend the inheritance of the West, certain voices will rush to label the speaker far right or extremist. A certain Prime Minister is good at that. They do this because it spares them the trouble of engaging with the argument. Let us look instead at what it means to be a conservative. My definition of a conservative is not a reactionary who wishes to stop progress, quite the contrary. A conservative is a person who, while keen to see society constantly advance in terms of health, wealth, happiness and security, never loses sight of the great gifts bequeathed to us by 2,000 years of Western civilization. Free speech, freedom of religion, parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, property rights, meritocracy, and the scientific method. I consider myself to be a conservative rather than somewhere on this left-right spectrum. I think it's hard for people of the left to be critical of conservatism when defined like that. It is precisely because these gifts have been so extraordinary that we must ask with real urgency how we arrived at our current situation, where our very civilization is under attack. How has a civilization that once produced the greatest flowering of art, science, law and liberty in human history found itself so uncertain of its own worth, so eager to apologise for its existence, and so willing to dismantle the very institutions that sustained it? The story begins in the early 20th century with the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, who argued that the working classes of the West would never rise in violent revolution so long as they remained attached to their culture, their traditions, their families and their faith. The solution, he said, was, quote, a march through the institutions, a patient, long-term subversion of the schools, the universities, the media, the churches, the arts, every pillar that upheld the so-called bourgeois society. Only by capturing the commanding heights of culture could Marxism hope to prevail. Around the same time in Germany, a group of intellectuals associated with the Institute for Social Research, the so-called Frankfurt School, took this insight further. Many were of Jewish background and fled the Nazis in the 1930s, finding refuge in the United States, particularly at Columbia University. They developed what they called critical theory, not a neutral tool of analysis, but a weaponised form of Marxism aimed at dismantling Western culture from within. One figure stands out, Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse joined the Frankfurt School and after exile in America produced his most influential work, One-Dimensional Man, in 1964. The book sold over 100,000 copies and was translated into numerous languages. In it, Marcuse called for the abolition of labour as we know it, the total reconstruction of cities and the outright transition from capitalism to socialism. He spoke of utopia as it was just around the corner, if only the existing order could be swept away. His message found a ready audience amongst the radical young. Almost immediately, a cultural revolution swept the West, upending economic, political, sexual, religious and intellectual orthodoxies. Marcuse became a prophet to the new left. The Weather Underground in America, the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, the Black Panthers, militants who turned to bombings, assassinations and urban guerrilla warfare. They devoured his writings. They saw in him intellectual permission for chaos. Marcuse was quite open about the methods. In the late 1960s, he outlined a strategy for the radical left: the revolt of the affluent white intelligentsia, the radicalisation of the black underclass, the capture of public institutions, and the cultural repression of all opposition. They were essentially acting as a fifth column, where a fifth column is defined as a group of people acting against the best interests of their country, and even in some cases acting for an enemy of the country. The scale of the left-wing political violence in that era was astonishing, with arson attacks and bombings. Yet by the early 1970s, the armed revolution had stalled. Law enforcement under President Nixon hunted down the militants. Many were jailed or went to ground. Marcuse, ever the strategist, regrouped. He urged the radicals to abandon the bombs and instead embed themselves in the universities, the schools, the media, the social services. There they could wage a slower, more methodical war, spreading their ideas by contagion, undermining traditional morality, eroding the old hierarchies of value. The long march through the institutions, once a theoretical slogan, became a practical program, and it succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of its originators. Former Weatherman leaders, people who had once called for armed revolution, emerged from hiding, largely unpunished, and found comfortable berths in academia. The very people who had tried to bring down the system now staffed its most influential citadels. What followed was a remorseless takeover of the humanities and social sciences. Departments that had once concerned themselves with truth, goodness and beauty were colonised by an obsessive focus on colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and the endless catalogue of victimhood: class, race, gender. The purpose of education shifted from transmitting the glories of Western civilization to unmasking it as the root of global injustice. Then came a further mutation of critical theory. In the 1970s, Harvard's first black law professor, Derek Bell, helped to give birth to critical race theory. Where earlier Marxists had focused on class, Bell and his followers placed race at the centre. This guy had a real chip on his shoulder about white people. Racism, Bell insisted, was not a removable stain, but a permanent, indestructible feature of American, and by extension, Western, society. Colourblindness was itself racist. Merit, hard work, even the rule of law were reframed as tools of white supremacy. The American story was recast as one long tale of sinister oppression. The university, as a bastion of reasoned argument, thoughtful debate and academic freedom, was gone forever. The revolution overturned Western intellectual and cultural tradition in universities and replaced it with emotionalism, neo-Marxist minority rights and militant mob rule. Its outward expression is a codified regime of political correctness directed against the PC left's principal target, the white heterosexual male of conservative and/or Christian persuasion. Today, the evidence of this capture is overwhelming. Surveys of American university faculty in the social sciences now show large percentages identifying as radicals, activists or Marxists. Entire institutions now operate under the assumption of this new ideology. Black Lives Matter, to take one prominent example, was never merely a slogan about justice. It was, by the admission of its own founders, a self-described Marxist organisation with a program that spoke of dismantling capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy and the nuclear family. BLM protests were funded lavishly by wealthy foundations and billionaires. George Soros alone has poured hundreds of millions into activist causes. What began with genuine outrage over specific incidents quickly became a vehicle for far broader ideological aims. Critical race theory has since metastasised into what can only be described as a new religion, Marxist wokeism. It offers its own cosmology of original sin, whiteness, its own saints and sinners, its own rituals and confession and public shaming, its own promised utopia once the oppressive structures were finally torn down. Logic, reason, science, and even punctuality are dismissed as artifacts of white patriarchy. Individualism and delayed gratification are condemned as perpetuating supremacy. Dissent is not debated. It is shut down and cancelled. This is not liberalism gone a little too far. It is a total system that views the West as a crime scene to be dismantled. Its inherent adherents believe that by smashing capitalism, free speech, property rights, and the scientific method itself, they can reset society to year zero and build something more equitable. Pol Pot had the same idea. We now live with the consequences of mass paranoia in which thousands march under banners that would have once been thought insane. Queers for Palestine among them. But I would say that if these people ever get to Palestine, they're advised not to venture in the vicinity of tall buildings. We get tens of thousands of people marching over the Sydney Harbour Bridge with pro-Palestine banners. We get Grace Tame screeching, "Globalise the Intifada." This is a woman who was awarded Australian of the Year for standing up for victims of sexual assault, now promoting the barbarians who commit sexual assault on an industrial scale. Tame has become one of Australia's most detested females. Even dogs don't like her. The contradictions are glaring, yet they go unremarked by the faithful. Meanwhile, the very virtues that built the West, the Protestant work ethic, self-reliance, rational inquiry, tolerance under the rule of law, are routinely vilified as symptoms of oppression. We have lived through a cultural revolution comparable to the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Only ours shows few signs of abating. The institutions that once transmitted our civilization now seem intent on repudiating it. Ladies and gentlemen, that's how we've arrived at our present situation. Next, I will look at some of the threats to society that this mind virus has helped to nurture. The first one being climate change. We now turn to one of the threats to our lifestyle and our industrial future created by the lack of critical thinking brought about by critical race theory. I speak, of course, of climate catastrophism, that vast self-reinforcing catechism which has captured presidents, prime ministers, kings and secretaries general of the United Nations with the same fervour that once gripped the commissars of the Soviet Union. It is not merely policy, it is the new end-of-the-world belief. The origins of this theory lie in the deliberate ambitions of one man, Maurice Strong. Strong, a wealthy businessman turned global bureaucrat, understood something the rest of us was slow to grasp. That environmental alarm could be the perfect vehicle for the oldest dream of the internationalist class, the transformation of the United Nations into a world government ruled by unelected elites. He founded the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, in 1972, after orchestrating the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. His message was clear and unapologetic. The rich Western countries had grown fat by exploiting the Earth's natural resources. Therefore, they must now pay reparations to the poorer nations so that their economies might catch up. The UNEP did not remain a modest technical body. By 1988, it helped birth the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, whose very name suggests a panel of impartial experts, when it has always been, in reality, a political body tasked with producing the right conclusions. What began as a modest concern about possible warming became, under Strong's intellectual airs, a religious creed. Carbon dioxide was no longer the gas that made plants grow. It was the new carbon devil. And the solution was always the same: more power to the international bureaucracy, less power to sovereign nations, and above all, the throttling of the fossil fuels that had lifted billions out of poverty. Look at the statements of our current elites and our politicians, and you'll see how thoroughly this ideology has hollowed out their capacity for rational thought. And Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has been even more apocalyptic. The IPCC reports are a code red for humanity, he declares. The alarm bells are deafening. The evidence is irrefutable. He issued this famous statement. I'll try and sound a bit like him. The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived. It is of great concern that a man who makes a statement like that heads the United Nations. This is not science, it's a moral panic that serves a political purpose. And the purpose, as strong always understood, is control. Western nations, in their rush to virtue signal, are engineering their own economic self-destruction by banning, taxing, or otherwise rendering unusable the very fossil fuels that built their prosperity. Coal, oil, gas, these are not pollutants in the crude sense our betters pretend. They're the stored energy of the sun, captured over eons, that has allowed modern civilization to exist at all. To demonise them is to declare war on modernity itself. Bjorn Lomborg has released a recent report revealing that the global green transition so far has cost a massive $14 trillion and is rising at the rate of over $2 trillion a year. Nowhere is this folly more visible, more immediate and more painful than in here in Australia under the machinations of climate change and energy minister Chris Bowen. In his haste to reach net zero, Bowen has pursued a policy of renewable idolatry that has already delivered exactly what sensible people predicted: a large escalation in energy prices. And all the while, the blackouts and brownouts that were once dismissed as conspiracy theories have become seasonal visitors because intermittent wind and solar cannot be relied upon when the wind does not blow and the sun does not shine. This is not an accident. It is the foreseeable consequence of replacing dispatchable, affordable baseload power with subsidised toys that requires massive backup from gas, batteries and taxpayer-funded transmission lines spanning the continent. The result? Higher prices for the many, virtue signalling subsidies for the few, and an energy system less secure than it was a decade ago. Australians are paying for Bowen's zealotry with their livelihoods, their savings and their future competitiveness. Yet the crowning absurdity, the thing that reveals the intellectual bankruptcy of the entire enterprise, is the treatment of carbon dioxide itself. There is no scientific evidence that CO2 in the concentrations that we're talking about is harmful to the environment in any meaningful sense. On the contrary, carbon dioxide is an essential plant food. Without it, there would be no plants, no crops, no forests, no life on Earth as we know it. One of the world's leading climate scientists and former advisor to a US president is Professor William Happer. He is a friend of mine, and 2 years ago I arranged for him to do a speaking tour of Australia where he spoke to enthusiastic audiences saying that fossil fuels are the most reliable, low-cost source of energy. Professor Happer said that the modest increase in atmospheric CO2 over the past century has in fact contributed to the greening of the planet, substantially increasing the food available to feed people worldwide. The elites who parrot their disaster claims have lost the capacity to distinguish between a trace gas that sustains life and the apocalyptic fantasies that have been fed since their student days. Ladies and gentlemen, this cannot continue. The climate cult is not merely expensive, it's suicidal. It asks the West to dismantle the energy foundations of its prosperity, while China and India build coal plants with abandon. It asks us to impoverish our own people in the name of a salvation that will never come. Let the last word on this subject come from one of the finest minds of our time. In an enlightened speech at the 2023 Cannes Film Festival, Jane Fonda explained that climate change is being caused exclusively by men. specifically white men, adding that those men must be arrested and jailed. It's good for us all to realise, she said, there would be no climate crisis if there was no racism. There would be no climate crisis if there was no patriarchy. Now, my opening image depicted China as one of the threats facing Australia today. But time is against us. China is a topic for another day. Suffice to say, I urge Australian businesses to reduce their dependence on exports to China, and particularly for consumers to reduce our dependence on Chinese imports. Every time you buy a Chinese TV or refrigerator, you're helping support the Chinese military. That's all I'll say on China today. I now turn to what I consider the greatest threat to the future of Australia, the one that strikes at the very heart of Western civilization, Islamism. It is not a distant geopolitical rival or an abstract ideology debated in seminars. It is already inside the gates, advancing by demography, infiltration, and the cowardice of our own elites. While we argue over pronouns and net zero targets, a faith that has never known a reformation or an enlightenment is reshaping our streets, our schools, and our future. Egyptian-born Noni Darwish, who lived for 30 years in a Muslim-majority nation where everything about her life was dictated by the Islamic law code known as Sharia, escaped to America where she warns. And I wish a lot of politicians would listen to what she has to say. And I quote, "The goal of Islam is to establish Sharia law over the entire world. It is nothing less than the achievement of totalitarian power and subjugation of humanity to the most brutal set of laws of enslavement and to Arabise world culture, laws and politics." Her book, Cruel and Unusual Punishment, is one of the best expositions of Islam you'll ever read. If Albanese were to read the book, I'm sure he might have a different outlook on Islam. One of the few leading political figures to speak out about the threat from Islam is former British Prime Minister Liz Truss. In an important speech, she said, "We're not dealing with a load of social democrats that just want to raise taxes a bit and spend more on public spending. We're dealing with people who want to destroy Western civilization. This is what their aims are." When you look at a map of the Muslim world, it's important to note that prior to the 7th century, none of these countries were Muslim. They were Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, or other religion. Egypt, for example, was Coptic Christian. In the past 1400 years, Islam swept through and conquered them all. Islam twice tried to conquer Europe and was repulsed. This time they're doing it by stealth, utilising the Islamic policy of hijrah, which is conquest by migration. Migration is not merely movement, it is conquest by demographics. Muslims arrive quietly, build communities, and remain fairly low-key until they reach sufficient numbers to assert dominance. Then the mask slips. In cities across Europe and now Australia, we see it. Large numbers of males blocking entire streets to pray, prostrating themselves on public roads while traffic halts and police stand by. Call to prayer blasts from loudspeakers 5 times a day, drowning out the rhythms of ordinary life in suburbs that were once peaceful and secular. This is not integration. It is a slow, deliberate replacement of one civilization with another. Look at Britain today and you'll see the future the West has chosen for itself. What was once a confident, secular society has allowed the importation of a parallel civilization. The Muslim population has risen from negligible levels in the 1960s to well over 4 million, nearly 7% nationally, but 30, 40, even 50% in some cities and boroughs. Infiltration is complete. Grooming gangs, predominantly Pakistani Muslim networks in Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford and elsewhere, systematically raped and trafficked thousands of British schools, while police and social services looked away, paralysed by fear of being called racist. Muslim MPs and councillors now sit in parliament and local councils. Sharia councils operate openly, issuing divorces that leave women penniless and endorsing polygamy. Mosques, many funded by Saudi and Qatari money, host preachers who denounce the democracy and idolatry and call for the caliphate, demanding blasphemy laws by stealth, halal-only menus in schools and prayer rooms that function as political organising hubs. The British government and police are favouring Muslims over the local population. Britain's future is no longer in doubt if current trends continue. Major cities will have Muslim majorities within a generation. Free speech will be curbed by the fear of riots. Women's rights will retreat before honour-based violence, and the common law will compete with Sharia. The political class, Labor most shamelessly, courts the block vote and calls it diversity. We've heard that here quite a bit from our Prime Minister. The rest of the country calls it colonisation. Australia is not far behind. Our Muslim population is smaller, around 3.5%, but it is young, growing rapidly through immigration and birth rates, and concentrated with surgical precision in the very electorates that decide who governs. Western Sydney seats such as Blaxland, McMahon and Watson, and pockets in Melbourne now hold a balance of power for the Albanese Labor government. In its naked pursuit of these votes, the government has chosen appeasement over national interest. That's where he went down and visited the mosque just recently. Not that he got a very good reception. Prime Minister Albanese refused to even utter the word Islamism. Instead, he warns darkly of threats from the white supremacists and far-right extremists, a phantom enemy conjured to distract from the real one. He has softened his language on radical Islam, hesitated to condemn the most inflammatory pro-Palestine protests that have featured calls for intifada and the destruction of Israel, and poured public money into multicultural organisations whose real purpose is often the preservation of parallel societies. Integration failures, honour, violence, female genital mutilation, cases quietly hushed up, radical preachers on university campus are met with seminars on Islamophobia rather than enforcement of Australian laws. Ordinary Australians in suburbs that once felt safe and cohesive now see their tax dollars funding welfare for large polygamous families, their daughters' schools accommodating prayer demands that segregate by sex, and the streets hosting marches that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Mosques have proliferated. The threat is compounded by a direct assault on free speech. Australia's hate speech laws, vague and selectively enforced, already chill legitimate debate. Criticism of Islam or its doctrines risk being branded vilification, while calls for jihad or Sharia supremacy often escape scrutiny. The appointment of a Muslim, Aftab Malik, as special envoy to combat Islamophobia, that's quite a thing when you think about it, only accelerates this erosion. Note Anne Harley looking on approvingly in one corner. Mr Malik previously worked within the Lebanese Muslim Association as scholar in residence. He has been recognised as, quote, Muslim leader of tomorrow, unquote. It is not a neutral office for protecting individuals. It functions as an official mechanism to shield Islamist ideology from scrutiny, equating reasoned concerns about demographic change, parallel societies or scriptural demands with bigotry. In practice, it tells Australians that their worries about street prayers blocking traffic, loudspeakers disrupting neighbourhoods or grooming scandals are not legitimate civic concerns but symptoms of phobia. This is the final inversion. The doctrine that refuses to tolerate criticism now demands state protection from criticism, while the host society is told to remain silent as its freedoms shrink. If we do not act now with realism, with courage, without apology, the civilisation we inherited will not survive the century. Australia has time. Britain may not. The choice is ours. Let us choose survival. And let us acknowledge the one political party in this country prepared to tackle the problem without flinching. One nation. While the major parties triangulate and appease, One Nation names the threat, demands border control, insists on free speech, and refuses to bow before special envoys or hate speech inquisitions. In a parliament full of cowards and careerists, that voice is indispensable. The rest of us must now decide whether we will stand with it or watch our country slip quietly into the long night of Hijra. My book, Is It Too Late to Save the West, puts forward a 22-point plan which, if acted upon by political leaders and leading figures in society, could save the West. The following is a sample of the most pertinent actions. Do everything we can to halt the destruction of our economy by the climate zealots. Restore freedom of speech. Repeal racial vilification laws. Repeal all laws relating to multiculturalism. Cease taxpayer funding of ethnic groups and councils. Cease immigration from Muslim countries. Deport immigrant and refugee criminals. Without concerted and courageous actions like this, I fear that Western civilisation as we know it will very likely disappear within the next 2 generations. Thank you.